Hello, this is Aaron. Welcome back to the show. I've had Brad Littlejohn on the program before. You may recall that we had a very popular podcast discussing his book that he was the co-author of on why Protestants convert to Catholicism. And today he's back to discuss his new book, which is Called to Freedom, Revisiting Christian Liberty in an Age of License. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. I'm sure you'll want to pick that up. And then I should note he is also a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington. So, Brad, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Called to freedom. What is freedom?
Yeah, the definition I give in the book is, and this is kind of summarizing the work of Oliver O'Donovan for anyone who's familiar with him, but the concise definition is the capacity for meaningful action. And I try to unpack that in kind of three dimensions, looking at saying that freedom has to have both a positive and negative dimension. People may be familiar with Isaiah Berlin's distinction between negative and positive liberty, an inward and an outward dimension, and then also an individual and corporate dimension. And unless we're attentive to all of those kind of three axes, then we're not going to have a full orbed conception of freedom, and we're going to experience our freedom as lacking something. But if we don't, I think very often we don't operate with that full orbed conception. And so when we feel unfree, which we often do, we react by trying to assert our freedom in the only direction that we know, which for us today is generally a kind of, it's only negative, it's only individual, and it's only outward. And so we know that something's missing, but we don't know what it is.
Yeah, maybe unpack those a little bit. What for those who aren't familiar, negative and positive liberty.
Yeah. So, this comes from the 1958 lecture by Isaiah Berlin. And so negative liberty is basically the kind of classical liberal ideal of nothing, of sort of non-interference, right?
Don't tread on me.
Yeah, sort of don't tread on me. Get off my lawn, or my body, my choice, depending on whether you're giving kind of right or left versions of it. And the positive liberty is more the classical ideal of freedom, which is the idea that human action has to be purposeful and thus has to be ordered toward a telos. And so we're actually free to the extent that we are enabled to pursue the end that we have set for ourselves, and we are most free to the extent that the end we've set for ourselves conforms to reality. And Berlin notes that, Berlin is, in that essay, he tries to be even-handed, but he ultimately is a classical liberal, and he sees positive liberty as kind of, at least when applied in the political sphere, as inherently totalitarian. In the most extreme form, the communist state or the fascist state of the early 20th century was saying, we're here to help you become truly free. It may not feel like freedom, but we're helping you become the truest version of yourself. So he kind of warns that the idea of positive liberty, of a liberty that's actually ordered toward what it means to be truly human, can become quite dangerous if it becomes a political ideal, which I think, obviously, he's right, but I think we've also discovered that throwing positive liberty out altogether and having only negative liberty as a political ideal leads to moral anarchy and ultimately social, to the decay of any meaningful sense of society.
Yeah. Is this also related to the idea that you need to have resources? It seems to me I hear about positive liberty in the sense of like FDR's freedom from want, that you're not meaningfully free if you don't have any resources to pursue the good.
That is different. I think that that's not what Berlin has in mind when he talks.
Well, I'm just going to say I bring that. You hear that a lot, so I wanted to bring that up there for people who are thinking about that. Where does that fall in your schema?
Yeah, so I think where that would fit. I guess I would say it does fit under the heading of what I call positive liberty, and just the idea that, one example I give is, you can't say to a paraplegic that, oh, you're totally free to walk around just because nobody is holding you down. That and that's why my definition is the idea of capacity, right? So people outside of you can interfere with your liberty, but you also actually have to have the positive capacity to act for your freedom to be meaningful. And so some of those barriers to the ability to act could be at the level of resources. You do need to have a sort of basic level of resources to be free to act. Going beyond that, though, and this is where I would say, I think FDR is onto something, but I want to build it in a somewhat different direction. Is those resources for action are more? They're less a matter of material resources, and more a matter of social resources. That is to say, because we are made for one another, all free action has to take place within a community, and that's again part of my definition: capacity for meaningful action. If you're dropped into the middle of an Amazon tribe, and they're very friendly Amazon tribe, they're not cannibals, and they show you great hospitality, but you don't have freedom. You don't have freedom of speech because you have no idea what they're saying, and they have no idea what you're saying. And so the capacity for meaningful action requires a social context of shared meaning in which my actions have some purchase within the community. And so I think, in addition to saying there's certain minimum material resources that needed, there's a certain level of embeddedness in a community. And I think exclusion from community is the truest form of poverty, right? And I think this is part of the problem: is many poverty-fighting actions of the federal government have given people access to material resources while actually undermining the communities that used to give them a sense of identity and meaning. And so they're actually less and less free. I think of what's happened to the African American community over the last 50 years, for instance.
Now, you mentioned as part of this community. Is this related to your idea of individual and corporate freedom?
Yeah.
That's the one I think people.
Yeah. So, yeah. So, do you want me to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I'd love to. That's the one I think most people would be least familiar with, maybe.
Yeah, and that's the part that's probably been the most significant part of my own work, going back to my doctoral work on Richard Hooker. And I think, yes, we tend to think of freedom as something, it's a property of individuals. And not only is it a property of individuals, it's something that is threatened by life and community, the way we think of it. We think that if my freedom is maximized by me having the most options as an individual, then being part of any relationship that would limit my options, that would tell me how I ought to act, that is a threat to my freedom. And so you have more and more people who are in our country who are refraining from entering into even the most basic community, the relationship of marriage, because that's going to tie them down and threaten their freedom. But in fact, what we find is that there are many things that we're only able to do to the extent that we do them together with others, and in a way that in submitting to others to some extent. So a good example here would be a concert violinist, right? So the best violinist in the world is not free to play Beethoven's Ninth Symphony on her own. She's only free to play it as a member of an orchestra in which she commits to coordinating her action with many others, submitting her action to the constraint of the conductor. And the conductor enables the orchestra to have a corporate liberty to accomplish things together that really enhance the capacities of each individual, but only to the extent that the individual, gives, she doesn't have the freedom to just play whatever notes she feels like when she feels like them, but she is able to participate in a higher form of freedom made possible by that community. And we could say something similar. I think one of the areas I developed this is in how to think about the local church. And I think part of the reason the church in America is struggling is that it's adopted a consumer mentality. The local church is there to give people just a menu of different options to participate in. And the reality is that the local church is there to constrain our options and to say that we're going to worship at a certain time. We're going to worship in a certain way. You may not like all of the music selections this Sunday, but that's okay. It's a lot better than saying everybody belt out whatever song comes into your head. We wouldn't actually have the freedom of corporate worship without sacrificing a certain level of individual freedom.
Is corporate liberty something that exists primarily as a sort of just an artifact of the very nature of being part of a group, such as an orchestra or a church? Or do groups have sort of meaningful freedoms as corporate entities, like separately? So, for example, an ethnic minority saying that it has freedom for self-determination.
Okay, so you said, rephrase the question. You said, does
Well,
corporate
so,
liberty
so
just, yeah.
yeah, corporate liberty, you say corporate liberty is if you want to be part of an orchestra, then the very nature of being part of an orchestra requires that you submit your freedom to the group in order for the group to accomplish playing a symphony.
Yeah.
But does corporate liberty extend to the idea that the group itself has a sort of personality
Right.
that has a claim to meaningful action as a group, maybe in the same manner, not just in this technical sense that we have to be part of a group, but like, we have like, again, the example you would hear would be an ethnic minority in a country that is saying we as this group, as a collective, have the right of self-determination for our community. Where does that fit?
Yeah, so I would say, I hesitate a little bit about applying to ethnic minorities because that's such a slippery concept nowadays. And there's been, particularly in the 20th century, you had this kind of expansion of the national idea where more and more ethnic minorities were asserting their existence as some kind of meaningful corporate entity that therefore had a right to self-determination and nationhood. Today, it takes the form, and we still have that a little bit in Europe. Today, that takes the form more of, here in the U.S., of different identity groups within the nation that want to recognition for themselves. I think, what I'm more interested in, so again, I'm hesitant about that a bit because it's such a subjective idea. What actually constitutes a meaningful ethnic identity that that has a liberty of action. One of the synonym I sometimes describe corporate liberty as institutional liberty, and so I'm more interested in the kind of more formal side of it, right? A corporate organization that actually has some kind of visible institutional form. And so I think back to one of my inspirations is the early modern Protestant political theorist Johannes Althusius, who had an understanding of political society as, it's kind of consistent with what Burke talks about with the idea of little platoons, right? That political society is actually built from the bottom up by all these different organisms or institutions: the family, the church, the collegium is the term he uses, the bowling league, the Rotary Club, the university. All of these are self-governing corporate entities that ought to be able to exercise a degree of corporate freedom vis-a-vis one another and to some extent vis-a-vis the state. And I think we've lost most of that, and all we have now is the individual and the state, and we don't have any of these corporate bodies capable of exercising liberty in between.
I could go on and on the general topic of freedom, because there's a ton to discuss, endlessly discussed by philosophers for ages. But the subtitle of your book is about Christian liberty. And so specifically, what is Christian liberty? How have Christians understood the idea of Christian liberty?
Yeah, so the starting point of the book is that Christians, I think, in America operate in these kind of two parallel worlds of discourse, where on the one hand, you have the Book Common Prayer says to serve God is perfect freedom. And I think if you polled most American Christians and just said, to serve God is perfect freedom, true or false, most of them would probably say, yeah, I guess that seems true. Right? Freedom is found in Christ, and freedom is found in submitting to Christ, following Christ as the only path to salvation, the only path to true humanity. So they recognize that on one level, and yet the rest of in the vast majority of lives, they operate with an idea of freedom that consists in, again, multiplying your options, steering clear of commitments, not submitting yourself to anyone else's expectations. So how is it that we have this intuition, because it's deep in their biblical tradition, it's deep in our Protestant tradition, that there is this spiritual concept of freedom that lies in serving Christ, and yet we have this totally different concept of freedom that we use in other spheres. So what the book is seeking to do is kind of bridge those discourses and argue that the political liberty, first and foremost, requires moral liberty. This is an insight that, the founders made this point over and over, that if you want a limited government, if you want a government that's responsive to the will of the people, then it needs to be made up of people who are basically self-governing people. They need to be able to govern their own appetites if they're going to govern their fellow citizens. And they need to be subject to inward law if you don't want to have multiplying external laws to constrain your actions. So this political liberty depends on a kind of pre-existing moral liberty, and then I argue that moral liberty ultimately is only can only be fully developed and sustained in the soil of a spiritual liberty. And here's where I follow the Apostle Paul in Galatians and Luther's work on the freedom of a Christian, where the basic insight is that the most fundamental form of bondage that we suffer is bondage to the fear of death and to the sense of guilt, the oppressing guilt that we have, especially in the face of death and the fear of condemnation. And the attempt to we attempt to resist that by growing in virtue and becoming worthy of some kind of reward, but we recognize that we fall short, and we still feel oppressed by this burden of trying to prove ourselves, trying to be good enough, right? So the most fundamental freedom of all is the freedom from that condemnation, from that fear that lies in accepting the promise of Christ who sets us free. Through that setting free from the condemnation of sin, we are then enabled to rest upon the Spirit to be set free from the burden of indwelling sin. And that's the work of sanctification, which issues in moral freedom. And then, as I said, ultimately becomes the surest foundation for political freedom.
When I read, Paul's letters, I talk about, okay, freedom from death. I get that. That sounds great. Freedom from sin, bondage to sin. That sounds great. That's what I want. But then he says we're a slave to Christ. I'm a slave to Christ.
Right.
Like, wow, that doesn't sound like super appealing to an American in the 21st century. It's like, what do you mean? I'm not a slave to anybody. You're not the boss of me.
Right.
How does this idea, like specifically of being a slave to Christ, fit into this paradigm?
Yeah. So one of the points I make in the book is this Pauline insight that you have to be a slave to something. It's just a question of what or whom. So for Paul, we are set free from bondage to sin in order to become bondservants of Christ, and in that we find true freedom. Now, I think this insight that you're always a slave to something is something that we really should be very aware of as moderns. And this gets into chapter 5 of the book, where I talk about the role of technology. I think digital technology represents more than anything else the embodiment, or the disembodiment, we should say, of our modern ideal of freedom as limitless options, having everything on demand, and not having, and always being able to reserve the right to opt in or opt out. And yet, so we've developed these digital technologies in order to maximize our freedom, in order to be able to be much more self-determining than we could ever be in the physical world. And yet, nowadays, you can pay money for apps called Freedom that will turn off your access to your web browser for a period of time. Or there's this device called a brick, I'm told, where you can you scan your smartphone on it and it disables your smartphone so that you're not distracted. So we have this growing recognition, which I think it's been growing for a while, but I think the last year has really seen a turning point with Jonathan Haidt's book, for instance, where more and more people are willing to say out loud, yeah, I don't actually feel free in relation to my technologies. I feel kind of enslaved by them. And this shouldn't surprise us, right? To be free to follow your impulses without any restraint means to be enslaved to your impulses. So you're always going to be enslaved to something. It's just a question of what that is. And what I would say is that essentially what the worldly idea of freedom gives us is it says, here, have as many options as you want. And so then we follow our desires. We begin to be sucked into feedback loops of addiction to our lowest and basest desires. And then we find our freedom shrinking down and down and down until we're only able to just kind of keep doing the same thing, whatever it is that kind of scratches that itch. Whereas what Christ says is, no, 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 give up your desires, give up those options, commit to this one path. And then in that, you actually find through that submission opens up a whole field of freedom and creativity. And in the end, many different, there are many different paths of flourishing that come through following Christ. And I could just give the same example in secular terms uh, to marriage, right? In our culture says, man, I don't want to limit my options. I don't want to just commit to just one woman. I'd rather have the freedom to sexually experiment with a whole bunch of different women. And what that freedom usually amounts to for most people is being stuck, scrolling options on Tinder. If you're lucky, getting a first date, having to go through the same miserable ritual of first date pickup lines and unfulfilling one night stands that are actually extremely become very boring and repetitive. Not actually, it's not uh, what the world tells us it is. But in marriage, what happens is actually in committing to life with one woman, what you find is every day is different. Every day is a new opportunity uh, for different ways of experiencing joy with another person.
Yeah, I want to dig in on the technology point because you talk about it a lot. But first, I want to just ask you to sort of compare this Christian idea of liberty from, say, the New Testament with maybe classically pagan views from something like Stoicism or the various philosophies that they had, which seem to have at least some superficial similarities. You're free by sort of self-control and, setting your expectations correctly. And that's basically the path to like maximal flourishing or something like that. How does the Christian view relate to the classical pagan views?
Yeah, so in chapter 3, I talk a fair bit about this, and I think the basic answer we could give is that the classical pagans were broadly correct as far as they went, which is they did understand that there's a hierarchy of our desires. That as Lewis summarizes it in Abolition of Man, there's the kind of the head, the chest, and the belly, and we are most free, we are most self-governing when the head rules the belly through the chest. But the reality of most of us is we let the belly rule us. We let the lowest desires rule us. And so there has to be a self-disciplining through reason, and then not just through the individual reason, but through the formative influence of a community that shapes us in virtue, constrains our actions, shows us exemplars of what good action is like. And through that, we become a virtuous, self-governing person who doesn't completely stifle. And there are, of course, differences in the classical tradition, right? Where Stoicism is more emphasizes like actually just shut down your desires, just renounce them. Whereas for Aristotle, it's more about finding the golden mean. That's the following every desire in proper moderation, right? I think the Christian moral tradition takes up this classical pagan understanding of virtue and freedom through virtue, but what it emphasizes is that that's always a dead end if we are relying entirely on our own resources, because the reality is that the best we can do is hold one vice in check by appealing to a kind of higher and nobler form of vice, right? That essentially we appeal to our sense of pride. I don't want to be an ignoble person, and so therefore I'm not going to give in to my lusts. I'm going to restrain my lusts, and I'm going to be a noble person. I can take pride in my sense of virtue. That's Aristotle's ideal, right? The man who is virtuous and is very conscious of his own virtue, and his consciousness of his own virtue is what keeps him from ever giving in to his ignoble passions. The Christian understanding says that consciousness of your own virtue is still a form of slavery to self, is still a form of vice, and the reality is it also rests on self-deception, because if you're really honest with yourself, you will know that you're not nearly as virtuous as you think you are. So basically, the pagan ideal of virtue is basically telling yourself a lie over and over again and hoping you'll believe that lie. So Christianity says, actually, only by acknowledging that you can't attain virtue on your own can you really genuinely become able to start attaining virtue.
I do want to circle back to the technology point, maybe as we come towards the end of this conversation, because I look at today's mass media society where desires are created, shaped, etc. Consent is manufactured through essentially media narratives that are often explicitly constructed in order to do that. Now we can think about it taking it to the next level with these algorithms where these social media companies are essentially telling you what you should want, what you should believe, etc. I watch people, where I live, all of a sudden start spouting all these talking points. And clearly, they didn't get that through a process of reflection or study. It's just the current thing came in through the apps, and now they believe it. I mean, are people in 21st century America who live in this sort of media-saturated, algorithm-saturated environment meaningfully free in any sense of the word?
No, I don't think so. And I think more and more of us are, it's just people I talk to, but more and more people are really waking up to that fact. And I mean, when I've given talks about this book, the line that always resonates the most is I say, when was the last time that you opened up Netflix and sat there, kind of aimlessly scrolling, trying to figure out what the heck you wanted to watch, right? That this idea that giving me more and more options is going to increase my freedom, we actually realize beyond a certain point, a fairly limited point, more options actually becomes paralyzing. You don't know what the heck to do with all these different options. And so you actually then look for someone to choose for you. You don't know how to use your freedom. And so someone else tell me what to do. In this case, Netflix has said, oh, people actually don't want to choose what to watch. They want to be told what to watch. And so our algorithm is going to tell them, here's what we think you would like, right? So the algorithm, the digital space first opens up limitless options to us. And then because we can't manage them, the algorithm comes in and says, here, let me steer you in the direction that I think you'll most want to go. And so what we end up doing is we either do whatever everybody else is doing. The algorithm operates in two main ways, right? Here's what everybody else is doing. Here's the top 10 on Netflix. You want to be where the popular people are, right? And a lot of us go that way. Or it says, here's what you have done in the past. Do you want to keep doing that? So the algorithms either steer us toward conformity with the mass or to a kind of sort of boring self-repetition, neither of which I think we would say is meaningful freedom. The capacity to actually choose wisely among a large number of options is something that only comes through self-discipline, working within constraint, and thus becoming a mature person. This is the basic journey from childhood to adulthood. Is we recognize children are not able to use freedom well, or we used to recognize this. I think one of the issues in our society now is trying to empower children with all the rights of adults. So children need their options limited more. Through that, hopefully, if you do your job properly, then they grow up into a mature, self-governing adult who is now better able to look at a wide array of options out there in the world and say, which one is most consistent with my flourishing? But I think what we've done is we've kind of, basically from earliest ages, we subject people to far more freedom than we're ready for. And then the result of that is that we all become kind of addicts or conformists.
My last question is also on technology. What do you make of the transhumanism push? It seems there's a big segment of the tech world that wants to essentially transcend the limits of human biology and consciousness to achieve immortality, maybe merger with a machine consciousness. It varies in form, but it seems a desire to almost use human technology to engage in a godlike transformation of humanity itself. Where does that come from? and how should we think about that?
Yeah, so the book that I reference quite a bit throughout is, of course, C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man, where he, in his last chapter, he sort of sees that coming, right? I mean, 80 years ago. And its root is in this idea that our freedom is maximized by overcoming constraints, overcoming the limits of nature. And for a good while, that makes sense, right? If you're living in a pre-modern society where most children die before age 5, most adults die in their 40s, there's all sorts of ways in which our natural environment radically constrains us, such that we're just kind of living hand to mouth and hoping that we'll survive to the next day. There is an appropriate desire to expand our freedom by overcoming those natural limits, by subjecting nature to human control. And we have a whole series of ways in which we do this, through the development of technologies of medicine, through the things like damming up rivers, through different ways of growing food. So coming into the 20th century, we have this tradition of mastering nature, exerting human freedom by mastering nature, and thus expanding human freedom, reducing the constraints within which we have to operate. But Lewis says that this process, it's one of these things that to keep on moving in the same direction doesn't always yield positive results. There's a point where you reach diminishing and then negative feedback. He says it's like a certain Irishman who had discovered that a new kind of stove would reduce his heating bill by half, and so he assumed that 2 such stoves would enable him to heat his house for free. So that's how we think with technology. We've been getting more and more freedom by moving this direction. Let's just double it, and then we'll be maximally free. And that's what the Transhumanist Project says: is okay, the last frontier is human nature itself. We've mastered all the other nature outside of us. Now let's tackle the human body and the human mind and see if we can set ourselves free from ourselves. And Lewis says this is the point at which it becomes self-contradictory. The one who is, we gain freedom only at the cost of assaulting human nature. So I think this is, and what he says, I think it's very profound and prophetic, is we say we always talk about we, humanity should do this. In reality, what do we mean? We mean a small number of very technically sophisticated, politically well-connected, and wealthy human beings should gain the power and then wield it over the rest of us, right? That, in fact, any of these attempts to free humanity from itself are subjecting humanity to these highly developed techniques that are wielded by a small handful of people. So, in fact, what we call man's power over nature is actually man's power over other men using nature as his instrument. So, and again, where I'm optimistic, I try to be optimistic, is that I like to think that common sense is reawakening. That a lot of people, when you tell them some of these crazy transhumanist ideas, they appeal to a certain number of Silicon Valley weirdos. But most people are like, no, that sounds gross. That sounds weird. Mm-hmm. I don't want a chip embedded in my brain, And if you point out to them, well, but isn't that going to increase your freedom? They're going to say, well, that's not the kind of freedom I want. I think more people are waking up to the fact that this technological project we've engaged in is reaching this point of reductio ad absurdum. And it presents an opening for us to actually rethink what we mean by freedom, rethink how we want technology to serve and enhance our freedom, and to realize that, in fact, the only way in which we can experience freedom is by learning again to operate within constraints.
Yeah, I have to be honest. I think some of the transhumanism stuff people talk about, it seems a little spooky to me. My fear is that that's just my inner boomer curmudgeon talking, and that these young generations won't find anything spooky about it at all. But we'll see how that turns out. My guest today has been Brad Littlejohn. He's the author of the book Called to Freedom, Revisiting Christian Liberty in an Age of License. Again, there's a link in the show notes to buy it. Brad, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.